welcome. My name is Risto Kiviluoma. I'm a chairman of the Finnish group of IABSE, and I will moderate this webinar for you today. So first of all, IABSE is an international association of bridge and structural engineering, and IABSE's mission is to exchange knowledge and exchange the practice of structural engineering worldwide. So we are dealing with all aspects of structural engineering, all types of structures and structural materials, and all aspects of construction process. So we have at the moment about 2,500 members and in 100 countries. So IABSE is some kind of organization which dealing all aspects of structural engineering without any favoring any materials or structures or so whatever. So today's webinar is dealing with the second generation Eurocodes, and the background of this webinar is that the Finnish group of IABSE organized a club event in June about how the new Eurocodes will be implemented in Finland. And there one of my clients told me that why don't you invite your colleagues in the WSP UK to join our club event, because they are widely in charge of developing these new Eurocodes. And that event was pretty nice, so we decided to repeat it now as an IABSE webinar for the wider audience. And before I introduce the speakers, I would like to say a few practical things. First of all, we are recording this event so that you can look at it afterwards into internet. And secondly, all of you will be muted all the time. So whenever you have a question, you can put the question into question and answer chat. So the question and answer you will find in these buttons below the screen. So basically, whenever you have a question, put it in the question and answer box, not in the chat box. Okay, I think I'm ready to introduce the speakers. They come from the United Kingdom. And first of all, Professor Steve Denton, he's a head of civil and bridge and ground engineering in WSP UK. But the reason he is here is that he is the long-standing chairman of the European Standardization Committee, CEN, and he is chairman of the Technical Committee 250, who is responsible of developing the new Eurocodes, or the second generation of the Eurocodes. And the second speaker is Dr. Maria Pia Angelino, also from the WSP UK. He is an associate in Bridge Department, and she has been involved or leading the technical review process of the second generation Eurocodes. Today we will hear about the development process of the Eurocodes, the publication plan, and what kind of impacts the Eurocode system has to our profession, and also about this review process. So I think we are ready to hear the presentation, and after these two presentations we will have a devoted time for going through your questions, and we will make it in that way that I will read those questions and introduce the questions, and the panelists are then able to answer the questions. So from these words, please Steve, the floor is yours, and you can have your presentation. I stop the sharing.
Fantastic. Thanks, Risto. Let me share my screen. So hopefully you can see that okay. So let's come through, Risto.
Yep.
Yeah, fantastic. So,
Yes.
Great. So good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be presenting to you today, and I wanted to start by thanking IABSE for this invitation. I understand that we have got participants from all around the world, and so thank you for sparing the time. I hope you're going to find this a useful session, and I'd say it's a pleasure to be sharing this presentation with my colleague Mario Pierangelo, with whom I've worked very closely on Eurocodes and other things for many years now. I wanted to start with a few facts and figures. So when the first generation of the Eurocodes was introduced, or prior to its introduction, the European Commission undertook an impact assessment, and they determined at that time that they anticipated that the Eurocodes would impact the professional lives of around 500,000 engineers in Europe alone. And of course, the Eurocodes are used extensively outside of Europe, so that's probably an underestimate of their impact. They also estimated that at 2007-2008 prices, they would impact a market for professional services worth around 65 billion euros. So these are big numbers, and I think in my role leading the evolution of the Eurocodes, you can imagine that sometimes that feels a little daunting when you see the scale of impact of the work that we're doing. The Eurocodes currently comprise 59 parts, 10 standards in 59 parts. That will change a little bit with the second generation. They currently comprise around 5,000 pages. And again, because the scope of the Eurocode suite is extending, I anticipate that will go up a little bit. But we're also, as Mario Pierre will explain, working hard to try and make sure that we keep the documents as succinct as we can. At present, the Eurocode suite contains over 1,000 nationally determined parameters. Those are a key component of the Eurocode model. They enable countries to determine values to use for particular defined parameters, either because of matters that are retained as with national authority, such as safety factors, for example, or because they are parameters that are subject to geographic variation, like wind actions or snow or thermal actions, where obviously the maps need to be varied between countries. CEN has 34 member countries, so the challenge is to develop standards that are agreed across 34 countries. And the TC250 family that is working on the evolution of the Eurocodes is large. We have almost 100 active subcommittees, working groups, and task groups. At a European level, there is probably approaching 2,000 experts involved in this project. And when you consider the activities happening at a national level, then it's probably several tens of thousands of experts who are actively engaged in Eurocode evolution. We sought at the outset of this program support from the European Commission, and the European Commission have been tremendously supportive, along with EFTA. And for the first phase of work, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in due course, but for the first phase of work, they awarded us a grant of 4.5 million euros. At the time they made that available to us, it was the largest standardization grant in European Commission-funded standardization activity. And for the subsequent phases 2, 3, and 4, the total grant that we've received is over 11 million euros, making this by some margin the largest standardization program in European Commission-funded project history. And of course, this investment from the Commission is significant, but only represents a fraction of the overall investment in this effort, with huge amount of effort coming from individuals, from organizations, from client bodies, from regulators, that applies a significant factor over and above that level of investment. To drive the evolution of the Eurocode, we established 73 funded project teams, typically with 5 or 6 members, and those were selected through an international competition. 25 of those project teams were in our first phase of activity, a further 22 in the second phase, and we currently have 26 in phases 3 and 4. And those are going to be concluding soon. And those phases, again, as I will say, have been overlapping one another. The first of our new documents within the second phase, second generation program, was actually concluded in 2020, went through formal vote in 2020, a technical specification document. And we are currently, again, as we will talk about later, going through a quite intense program of formal inquiry and formal vote that will lead to the final documents of the second generation of the Eurocodes being made available to national standards bodies during 2026. And although that feels like it's still somewhere away, actually, as we will show to you, there is a huge amount to do over the coming years. So there's a few facts and figures. Let me just explain the structure of what I want to talk to you then about today. So I want to start off with a little bit of background. I then want to take a few minutes to talk about why design standards matter, and to some extent why personally I invest as much time as I do in this field. I then want to share with you the aims for the evolution of the structural Eurocodes and talk a little bit about process and timing. And then Maria Pia will talk further around that, and particularly around the publication schedule and publication planning. So in terms of background, I think it's always helpful to understand the background of any speaker. So let me start off with a little bit about my personal background. So as Risto has said, I'm the chairman of CEN TC250, and that's the committee with overall responsibility for the structural Eurocodes. My principal role, I guess my day job, is as WSP's head of civil bridge and ground engineering. So I lead a group of over 600 engineers, a business that turns over around 50 million. My part of the business turns over around 50 million pounds a year. So I do come at my work on TC250 very much with the perspective of a practitioner, and I spend a lot of my time involved in projects, as well as leading that part of our business. But I also combine that with a role as a visiting professor at the University of Bath. And since I held a sort of minor academic position at Cambridge University many years ago, I've sought to maintain close links with academia and research. So I hope to bring that perspective as well to my role as chairman of TC250, and also for several decades now I've been an advisor to clients and to government. And so I understand some of their challenges and look to bring that perspective again also into the work as chairman of CEN TC250. As I mentioned, TC250 is a large family, a large organization. This is the sort of top tier groups. And you can see here that we have subcommittees lead on the development of the each of the Eurocodes, as well as several groups that are there to drive horizontal consistency across the Eurocode suite. And before moving on, one of the important things that I wanted to acknowledge as well is that the Eurocodes operate as part of a family of European standards. So the Eurocodes are the documents that cover design, but they work in conjunction with the European standards for products and European standards for execution, so construction specification documents. And the interdependence and the interrelationship between those different standards is very, very important, and something which has been a real focus for us in the evolution of the Eurocodes. So now let me move on and just briefly talk about that point about why design standards matter, and share a little bit of my perspective on these points. And I guess as an audience that's chosen to attend this webinar, you probably share my perspective that design standards are important. But as I said, let me talk a little bit about why I think that's the case. The first point is about impact. I've already talked about the fact that the Eurocodes are used by somewhere over 500,000 engineers. the impact of what we do is profound in developing these standards. As I said, sometimes it feels quite daunting. I think it's a huge privilege. You know, how often does one have the opportunity to work on something that is going to impact so many people? And let's remember that with construction representing something around 10% of most countries' GDP, you know, and what is built needs to be designed, and what is designed, if it's designed to the Eurocodes, just shows how, you know, huge economic impact that arises from the standards and the work that is designed using the standards that we are working on. The second point is around verification of adequacy. It's a slightly clunky term, really, but my point here is this, that in contrast to most other branches of engineering, the projects that we do as civil structural engineers are at a scale where it is really impossible typically to prototype and to learn lessons in labs or through prototypes. You know, in contrast to most other branches of engineering, where lessons are learned in labs and factories, for us, we tend to learn our lessons in the full glare of public attention. But what that means is that we need a method by which we can verify the adequacy of our designs before they are built. And that's the fundamental role of design standards, to enable us to have the confidence in our designs before they are constructed. You know, and that is different from other branches of engineering, and it is why design standards are perhaps almost uniquely important in the structural engineering and geotechnical engineering realms. You know, one of the other characteristics of the construction sector is that it is quite fragmented. You know, we have an awful lot of different parties that are involved, from the original conception of a project through feasibility, design, construction, maintenance. You know, when we go through the whole life cycle, there will be a huge number of different organizations involved. And it's characteristic of systems where you have a lot of organizations involved that it becomes difficult to gather and learn from feedback. You know, it is quite different from, say, an automotive, where you would have an organization that would very likely have line of sight from conceptual design to maintenance of vehicles. And if there's a recall of a car for some reason, I'm sure the consequences of that and the implications of that are felt the whole way through that organization. In the construction sector, it's a challenge for us. It's a challenge for us to learn lessons because we are quite fragmented. But we know that standards play a really important role in providing a mechanism for feedback. And we know that's true because in those times in the past where there have been significant collapses or important transitions in learning, then very often those have been a stimulus for heightened activity around improving standards. And that just demonstrates that those design standards are being used as a really, really critical feedback mechanism. Standards are also a very, very powerful vehicle for adapting, changing what we do in response to new societal demands. And the efforts that we're taking in the evolution of the Eurocodes linked to sustainability, climate change, decarbonisation are perhaps an illustration of how we're looking to embrace and respond to new societal demands within our design standards. And then finally, and again really importantly, is that standards serve as a very important mechanism through which research, once there has been sufficient application to develop confidence, can be transitioned into a widespread application. And so standards have a really important role to play in providing a pathway to impact for research findings. So now let me move on and talk about the aims for the evolution of the structural Eurocodes themselves. And quite simply, we have two principal overarching aims for everything that we do. The first is that we want to enhance the use of the Eurocode suite. And the second is that we want to achieve exemplary levels of international consensus. And what I'm going to do now is just to unpack those a little bit and talk about the actions that we've taken to support those objectives. So first, in relation to enhancing ease of use. So one of the first things I did when I became chair of CENTESE 250 was that I established an advisory panel to examine this question of what does enhancing ease of use mean to us? What steps should we take to achieve that? And that group, which had 16 international experts in it and consulted very widely, developed a position paper that was subsequently unanimously endorsed by the 34 SEN members. And it set out a vision for us, the vision that you can see on the screen now, that very much respecting the achievements of the past. And there were huge achievements in developing the first generation of the Eurocodes. That our vision for the second generation was to create a more user-orientated suite of design standards that we want to be recognized as the most trusted and preferred in the world. That paper then went on from there to talk about how we should go about doing that. And that was built around 5 pillars. The first, statements of intent to meet users' needs. The second, relating to principles and related priorities. The third, examples, strategic performance measures, and then mechanisms for management, governance, and support. And I'm going to go into these in a little bit more detail, and Marie-Pierre will augment that in her presentation as well. So starting with the statements of intent to meet users' needs and the principles and related priorities. Now, the first thing we did was to recognize, and I guess we typically do this in on any occasion where we're producing a document. You know, the first thing you have to do is to ask yourself, who is the primary target audience? And given the number of people involved in the development of the Eurocodes, it's so important not just to establish that, but also to make sure that that is well communicated to everybody who's working on the evolution of these standards. So we determined that that primary target audience should be practitioners, competent engineers, and we developed a definition of that. And again, it took some time for everyone to feel comfortable with this, but I think it's a very useful definition. Competent civil, structural, and geotechnical engineers who are typically qualified professionals, but for me, the really important point here is that they are able to work independently in the relevant fields. I think being responsible for the development of many hundreds of engineers over the years, you know, I typically see in people's careers that there comes a time, often maybe 3 or 4 years postgraduate, when they've got that much experience, when there's a transition to be able to work much more independently. And I guess it's that sort of person with that sort of experience that we're asking people to have in mind when they are working on the evolution of the Eurocode, when you're drafting clauses, when you're thinking about what are reasonable expectations to have of our primary audience. We then went beyond that and said, okay, that's our primary audience. Those are the primary Eurocode users, but we have many, many other Eurocode users. And we thought about each of those groups, and we set out statements of intent of what we would aim to do for each of these groups. And here on the next slide, I'm just going to blow up the top section of that table because the font was a little small on your screens. So for those practitioners, competent engineers, our primary audience, we said we'll aim to produce standards that are suitable and clear for all common design cases, importantly, without demanding disproportionate levels of effort to apply them. But others I could draw out here in terms of, say, expert specialists, where we say we will aim not to restrict innovation by providing freedom to experts to apply their specialist knowledge and expertise. Or again, moving on to educators, you know, we will aim to use consistent underlying technical principles irrespective of the intended use of a structure, and that facilitate the linkage between physical behavior and design rules. You know, or for regulators, you know, endeavor to produce standards that can be referenced or quoted by national regulation. So all of these are in our consciousness as we're developing the Eurocodes as our statements of intent. And to some extent at the end of this process, it will be those users that will be able to challenge us and tell us whether we fulfilled those statements of intent. But certainly it was our feeling that we would do better by setting these out from the start and then working hard to try to fulfill them. You know, what we also did under that second pillar was set out a set of principles and related priorities. We split these into general principles and specific principles. And again, looking at those general principles first, working to improve clarity and understandability, improving accessibility, essentially ease of navigation, looking to improve consistency, looking at state-of-the-art material where importantly, what we include has been validated through sufficient practical experience, and also more broadly, recognizing the need for the second generation of the Eurocodes to be an evolution. So there aren't too many fundamental changes, unless, of course, there's adequate justification for doing so. And in some parts, the changes to the Eurocodes are more significant than in others, but in each case, there is a very strong justification for the changes that we're making. And then I said a set of those secondary principles. And sometimes we find that some of these principles pull a little bit in opposite directions. Sometimes it leads to some very meaningful debates about exactly what we should be doing. But what we have done is established a framework, and a framework that everyone has agreed, that gives us a basis upon which we can have those discussions. And then those remaining three pillars: examples, strategic performance measures, the management, governance, and support. There's a number of things we've done. The appointment of a technical reviewer, again through international competition, which is the role that Mario Pia has. The detailed review of deliverables, the development of guideline documents, provision of examples and advice. And again, Mario Pia will add a little bit more detail to this. We've set out a guide on what good drafting is. Drafting of standards is a very, very skilled activity. And so, for example, here we set out a set of 6 tests that we ask people to ask themselves as they are working on drafting documents. And again, Mario Pia will talk a little bit more to that when she speaks. And what does this look like in practice? And I don't have time to go through lots and lots of technical detail today, but just as an illustration of a few things that we've sought to do. So, on the left-hand side of the screen, you can see the text from the current EN 1990, and on the right from the inquiry draft of the new EN 1990 basis of design Eurocode. And so one of the things that we've sought to do is, we still do in the new Eurocode have expressions for how actions are combined, but we've also sought to give users something a little simpler and a little bit more intuitive in terms of providing these tables that express how the partial factors and combination factors should be constructed in different combinations of actions. Or another effort to enhance ease of use has been around the way that in the current Eurocode suite, we have what are referred to as set A, B, and C of partial factors for STR and GEO verifications. In the Eurocode, we have created what we call design cases. And so we can set out all of those factors then in a single table, and the differences are then much more transparent between them. Another illustration around sort of consistency and navigability. So in the current Eurocode suite, we introduce the possibility of differentiation of partial factors by reliability class. But at the moment, that sits within an informative Annex B, and its connection to the other parts of the document is perhaps not as clear as it might be. And so in the new drafts, what we'd look to do is to make that much clearer within the relevant parts of the Eurocode. I talked about that connection with product standards, and so, for example, in connection to bridge design, a new annex that deals with design of bridge bearings, which interfaces much more clearly and much better with EN 1337, which is the product standard for bearings. And we've been working very well with TC 167, who have responsibility for those documents, try and make sure that that interface is as effective and smooth as possible. Another illustration, the treatment of robustness is a really challenging area in standards. We set out currently in the existing suite a set of strategies for dealing with accidental design situations in EN 1991-17. We've sought within, we're seeking within the new Eurocodes to be a little clearer in terms of where these matters are handled from a robustness perspective in EN 1990, contrast to dealing with defined accidental actions, which we're handling in EN 1991. Again, hopefully that makes things a little clearer, a little bit more intuitive for designers. Another example of just trying to, things that we've learned in terms of feedback and through practice. The text on the left deals with bridge temperatures, and there's obviously that important parameter when you're designing a bridge around that temperature T0, that temperature at fixity. Of course, the practical reality is that that's rarely a single number, that normally when you design, you have to design for a range. Otherwise, you place an undue constraint on the contractor. And we've sought to recognize that again within the, at the moment, the working drafts of EN 1991-15. And one of the other things we've sought to do, and I talked about this horizontal consistency, that is something, again, which in this case for the bridge related parts, we have had a team looking at, and they have been looking at particularly how we can have the style of presentation more consistent between the bridge related content, because many of you will be familiar with the fact that we do take a slightly different approach in the year 1992 for concrete at the moment than we do in 1993 for steel and 1994 for composite structures and 1995 for timber. The approach, the presentational style, where we have got bridge-related content that extends or modifies, augments, or replaces existing or content applicable to building structures. The way in which we do that is a little inconsistent, and so we've developed guidelines for doing that on a more consistent basis. And there have been challenges, and there have been long discussions, for example, about where that content should be housed. And actually, what we found is that during the review process, where we've identified actually quite a lot of content that was in some of the bridge parts can be applicable to other forms of structures, and a lot of that has migrated into the general parts for the second generation of the Eurocodes, meaning that the bridge-specific material, in some cases, is much shorter. And as a consequence, we've agonized long and hard, but come to the conclusion that certainly in the case of concrete structures, it makes more sense for that material to be contained within an annex rather than a separate part. And that was a long debate around the right way to handle that. So that's a little bit of an illustration of what we've been doing in terms of enhancing ease of use. And again, Maria-Pia will talk a little further to that. Let me talk then about achieving exemplary levels of international consensus. That it's my job as the chairman of a CEN technical committee to abide by this part of the CEN internal regulations. And I have to confess, when I first read this, I'm not sure whatever it was, 12 or so years ago, but I don't think I really understood that. And in a way, for me, this sense of trying to achieve consensus versus unanimity, as I said, I think something which we've really evolved the way we approach within TC250 in a very, very constructive fashion. And of course, what consensus means is arriving at a point where, although the outcome may not be everyone's number one preference, that it's a position that everyone can stand behind. So in the end, you hopefully get a unanimous support, but it's unanimous support based on a consensus position that everyone can support, rather than necessarily everyone's number one preference. And we have set out how we will work to achieve that, including position papers that again have been unanimously endorsed by all of the CEN members around how we will work together and the steps we will take to try to find that path to achieve consensus. And I should say, in that respect, we've been exceptionally successful. That we have now taken somewhere approaching or probably over 300 formal decisions since I became chair, and there have been almost no negative votes, despite some of those decisions being really challenging decisions. There have been almost no negative votes throughout that time, because we've worked hard to establish a consensus position before we formalize the decisions. And then let me quickly just talk through a little bit on process and timing before I hand over to Maria-Pia. So a key step in the evolution of the Eurocodes in the second generation was the European Commission issuing to CEN Mandate M515, which set out a basis for a funding agreement to support the evolution work. We responded to that with a technical response initially, with over 1,000 experts that were involved in setting this, producing this response. And that response included our proposals for the work that would specifically be done, mapped against a series of tasks and subtasks, as you would imagine, and contained within 4 overlapping phases, so that we could make sure that lessons that were learned, things, those clearly, there's interdependencies within the suite, and there are certain documents that needed to be handled first, so that the changes within those documents could inform what would happen in other documents. So clearly the work needed to be staggered in this fashion, overlapping phases, because otherwise the program would have just been too long. In terms of key changes to all of the Eurocodes themselves, but also the addition of initially technical specifications, but in due course there will be standards on structural glass, on FRP, on membrane structures, work on robustness, work on the assessment and retrofit of existing structures, work around climate change, and as I've said, ease of use as being a key driver for us. And the work that we've been doing has not just been a response to, if you like, that kind of top-down mandate, which defined a series of targets for us, but also we've undertaken systematic reviews of all of the Eurocode parts. All of the CEN members have had the opportunity to comment on the existing standards, and all of this has fed together into the work that we've been doing on the evolution of the Eurocodes. And if you want more details, and there's an awful lot, but if you want more details, then if you want details around how we're approaching this, document N1250, TC250 document N1250 is a key source. And if you Google CEN and Eurocodes, then you can get a link to the page where we contain that. Or if you want to understand a little bit more around the specification, project teams and what the project teams are doing, then you can still access the call for experts. And if you Google NEN and Eurocodes 2020, then again, you can get to this page where you can find a lot more details of exactly what the teams have been working on and are working on. So where does that take us to? Again, looking back and then looking forward, for a timeline, the first generation of the Eurocodes were developed and the final documents published by 2007. What broadly happened over that was a period of proprietary work for the second generation of the Eurocodes. We then moved into the work on the second generation of the Eurocodes with these overlapping project team activities. And then looking forward, the last standards will be made available to national standardization bodies in 2026. And then importantly, an obligation on those national standards bodies to withdraw the first generation of standards by 2028. The process behind this, within this, is quite complicated. This is a very simplified picture of it, but it differentiates here between the activities in red, which are the work done by the project teams, whose drafts are then passed to the relevant subcommittees and working groups, who review and develop and refine and take feedback to progress the documents to the state when they're suitable for what's termed formal inquiry. And we've had many informal inquiries prior to that point, but then we have a formal CEN inquiry process where all countries have the opportunity CEN members have the opportunity to comment formally on the proposed text. Then obviously a subsequent stage where that's reviewed, those responses are reviewed, then we finalize the document for formal vote. And if that formal vote is positive, then the document is made available to national standards bodies. It is useful when we're thinking around what's going to be happening over the coming years, just to be aware of 3 terms there. They're terms that are in like the standardization domain. As a practicing engineer, you wouldn't necessarily need to know them. But this is the concept of a date of availability, which is when SEN make a document available to a national standards body, a date of publication, which is the date when that national standard publish, but also really importantly, the date of withdrawal, which is the last date by which a national standard that conflicts with an EN needs to be withdrawn. And that date of withdrawal is important in the context of the second generation of the Eurocodes, because the date of withdrawal associated with the second generation Eurocodes is that date by which the first generation documents need to have been withdrawn. So essentially what we create with a date of withdrawal is a backstop date by which the first generation documents need to have been withdrawn. And we have a special derogation from the SEN Technical Board because of the complexity of the Eurocode program to set a defined date of withdrawal for all of the Eurocodes, second generation Eurocodes, EN Eurocodes of March 2028. So that's that backstop date when the first generation 1 documents need to be withdrawn. And that's confirmed date of availability. So all of the documents should be available to the national standards bodies by March 2026. And then between these dates, and to some extent prior to those dates, when for those documents released earlier, then it can be a national decision around how the transition from first generation to second generation is managed. And that needs to be a national decision because the Eurocodes have to mesh with different national regulatory frameworks in different countries. And so we need to offer countries the flexibility to be able to manage that transition in a way which is compatible with the regulatory structures that they have. So that gets to the end of what I wanted to share with you. So I will stop there and I will hand over to Maria Pia to then continue. So Maria Pia.
Thank you very much, Steve. Thank you. I'm sharing my screen now. So hopefully it should come through, and if you can confirm it, that would be brilliant.
Maria Pia, we can see the whole present app. That's working fine. Yeah, that's it.
Excellent, perfect. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, all. My name is Maria Pia Angelino, and today I will be talking to you about my experience and perspective as a technical reviewer for the second generation of the Eurocodes. I'm also going to present some key information around the publication plan. So I will cover these two components today. Over the last few years, over the last 8 years, actually, I have been involved in the activities of TC250. I started with the work on the response to the mandate of the European Commission, which Steve mentioned earlier. And I was also a member of the Chairman's Advisory Panel on Ease of Use. So I had the chance to discuss with other colleagues across Europe on the usability of the second generation of the Eurocodes, what could make the second generation more user-friendly. And today I will present to you some of the key findings and the approach we've taken to do that in my role as technical reviewer. In this role, I've got a unique opportunity to implement the TC250 vision for the second generation of the Eurocodes. And as Steve said before, what we want to do in the end of this work program is to create a more user-oriented suite of design standards. Of course, as you may imagine, this is far from straightforward, and it really is a huge challenge, but not just because of the intrinsic complexity of the Eurocodes, but also because of the different perceptions and expectations that people have on what usability means. So if I do a survey now and I ask you to say what usability is for the Eurocodes from your perspective, I'm sure that I will get many different answers depending on your background, your education, where you are in your professional status, if you're a graduate, if you're an expert. So what we wanted to do in this work really was to establish a rigorous process to review the Eurocodes and to ensure that the needs of the key audiences were addressed. So Steve talked to you about our target audience, but there were also other key players, other key audiences we look after in the second generation of the Eurocodes. To give you also some background information on myself, I am a civil and structural engineer, and I've got an engineering doctorate in systems engineering applied to technical standards. So standards really are very close to my heart, and I have been working with Steve on this for a few years now. The work on the Eurocodes is just a part of my day-to-day work. I have been supporting several clients in the UK to implement the Eurocodes, to develop new standards and technical specifications. And more recently, I have been working for the government's body, National Highways, responsible for developing and maintaining the design manual for roads and bridges. And I can see there is a question in the chat box on that, on the DMRB as well. And the associated manual of contract documents. So I'm talking about over 500 client standards and specifications. And the vision's implementation strategy. This is linked with the work done on the Eurocodes because of the thinking behind, which is very, very similar. So I'm sharing my experience also based on this background. So today, what I'm gonna cover is some general background information on the work done on Easy of Use. And I will then present how I'm approaching the technical reviews in considering the implementation of the TC250 vision and some of the preliminary outcomes that we can see from the work done by the project teams. And I will finish off this presentation giving an overview of the publication process and also some of the timing. So when you can expect to see the documents in inquiry stage, formal vote stage, and in publication. So let me start with some background. Steve talked to you about the importance that TC250 gives to improving the usability. So when we started this work, the very first question we had in mind was, what are the key challenges in terms of usability of the Eurocodes? And based on interviews, workshops, questionnaires, general discussions with practitioners, which shows that overall there are four main problems we can see in terms of navigation. It may be hard to find relevant information. It's not in the right place. You can't find it. Key rules are neglected. It's around the text complexity. We all know that the Eurocodes cover, they do cover some simplified approaches, but also some more sophisticated method of analysis. The text is complex because it does cover matters which are complex. There are also some microenvironmental factors here to consider. There are economic implications when you're writing clauses in a design standard. What's the impact on the cost of the design? There are different legal framework in place, and Steve mentioned that as well, talking about the different implementation that the Eurocodes have in different countries. There are different design traditions, different educational aspects, and this will then link with the personal issues. People may have different education, background, different perceptions of what a standard should provide. So to give you some examples of that, when I say difficult to navigate, what I mean is you open the Eurocodes and you may find this type of sections. There are pages and pages of content and you just don't know where you have to start. There is a lot of material which is not properly signposted, and it's complicated to find the relevant information unless you read the entire sections. There are inconsistencies at the moment that we have identified in terms of symbols, in terms of definitions. You could see here that a different terminology, for example, is applied for identical physical issues. And that is not helpful, particularly if you're using standards like 1992, 1993, 1994 composites. How the interfaces are managed sometimes doesn't work very well. Verb form is another area where we have spent a lot of time to solve the way in which the content is presented. In several places, the verb form used is not correct, And this is not just a grammatical or an academic issue. It really is a problem of presentation of what is a requirement and has to be followed, and what instead is advisory content, which instead is left to the there are just different options to do something, and from a designer point of view, you can choose the relevant one depending on the circumstances. But the distinction between requirements and advice was a really important one, and you can see here a couple of examples where you're providing a requirement. In the first one, but it's presented as a kind of note, are given in table. And in the second one, it is a note, but it does contain a recommendation, which in principle should be followed unless is adequately justified. So we are sorting these issues out in the second generation of Eurocodes using appropriate verb forms. Another issue we found is in terms of scope of application of the content. Sometimes it's not entirely clear, particularly if you're using a simplified approach, what's the scope of application? So there are different options, multiple methods that can be used, but it's not entirely clear when each of them can be used and what the implications are. And again, this is something that we are looking at in detail and sorting it in order to be absolutely clear on the scope of application of all clauses. From a technical review perspective, Steve was talking about the different pillars and how the vision has been implemented. So there was a report, a position paper produced back in 2015, which contained 5 pillars. But from a practical point of view, we have translated these pillars into some more tangible outcomes. We've got key documents that have to be followed because we have translated these into drafting rules. Some of them were existing, and then we added some more specific ones for the Eurocodes. We have the inquiry process, the informal inquiry process, and also Steve mentioned that there are a few informal stages done before the formal inquiry, just to make sure that we collect enough comments from the different national standard bodies. Steve has been sharing chairman briefing notes, and I will give some example later. We are actively managing lessons learned and risks for this work. This is effectively a major program of work, and in good practice of project management, you have to manage your risks for the 4 phases of the work program. Horizontal and ad hoc groups have been created. This has been really important to ensure consistency, like the ad hoc group, the horizontal group bridges, the horizontal group for fire, and other ad hoc groups to solve specific technical issues. And finally, my role was created, the role of technical reviewer, which I'm currently fulfilling. So to give some examples of these 6 points, when I said key documents to follow, I did mean the internal regulation part 3, which is a SEN document, which is followed by all technical authors, by all project teams. And we also have another document, which is specific for TC250, which augments the content of IR3, and it is called N1250 and is used by all technical authors. We've got the informal inquiry process. We've done many of them now for all phases of the work program. And each time we have been collecting thousands of comments, which the project teams had to answer. So just for phase 1, to give an example, the project teams received over 9,000 comments for over 1,500 pages, and they had to reply to each comment and implement the changes based on the comments received. Steve is also responsible for sharing briefing notes. So every time that there is an issue that is useful to clarify, Steve does produce these CB notes, which are then used sometimes to update N1250 with relevant rules. And then what I want to present here very briefly are the specific responsibilities that I have as technical reviewer. Overall, I follow the TC250 strategy for enhancing the ease of use. I review reports and technical deliverables. I've been producing, particularly at the start of my work, recommendations, detailed recommendations on how we can improve the usability of the Eurocodes. I've developed and I continue to develop guidance material, briefings to support project teams, and I also keep a library of notation and terminology to identify areas where more consistency could be achieved. So to date, we have implemented the 6 tests for good drafting, which Steve presented earlier, as you can see here. So these are the 6 key questions I do use when I review a draft to ensure that the clauses are understandable, are in the right place, they are clear in the scope of application. And in order to do that, I also identified some additional sub-questions, which are on the right-hand side of the screen, which in a way help me to undertake my detailed review of the drafts. As I said, I do review deliverables in detail, and I have been producing specific notes to the project teams to support their work. To give an example of something that I did when I started this activity, I undertook a comparison of different consistencies in how the content was presented. So as a result of that, we did develop a more consistent structure for all Eurocode parts on how basis of design should be presented. And the same has been applied also for other sections in the Eurocode. So you will see much more consistency in presentation and content in the second generation. Guidance material and briefings, that's another area that I have been working on to support the project teams. And you can see here a few examples of the type of work, a lot of examples produced to support the project team work. And finally, the notation and terminology, the library of notation and terminology. This has been a really useful tool for the project teams and for myself to ensure that the terms were used in an appropriate way, and also to check the usage of symbols. So here you could see a summary of the symbols and terms used for phases 1 and 2 of the work program. Quite a lot of symbols, as you can see here, over 5,600 symbols and over 1,500 terms used. So this is the work which is currently ongoing. And to give you an idea of the preliminary outcomes of the work, let me show you some examples, some practical examples, in addition to those Steve shared in his presentation. When I said at the start that one of the problems in the first generation of Eurocodes was navigation, we have taken actions to solve this issue, this problem. And you can see here, for example, in the year 1919, now we are introducing clear signposts. We are providing the information in the right place and helping navigation, reducing ambiguity, reducing duplication. So the text is more succinct whilst being clearer and provided in the right place. In some cases, also flowcharts have been added to help designers to find the relevant design methods. This is an example from 1993-11, which shows how different design methods should be used, whether or not like imperfections should be considered, the type of analysis to be used. We spent a lot of, we put a lot of effort into the verb forms, as you can see here. And what I could say is that when the examples have been followed and right verb forms have been used, we have seen a huge improvement in the drafts and in the clarity of the content. And at the same time, the text has also been streamlined in a few places because of this clarity applied. Terms and definitions, the glossary also helped to define identifying consistencies in how terms were used and to solve them within the project teams or the subcommittees as relevant. So it's just a tool, but if used properly, it does help to remove ambiguity in definitions. So that was to give you an idea of the examples in particular that the work done on this pillar, as well as the management, governance, and support applied. There is also another pillar which is really important for us, and this is on the performance measures. So we know that if we want to claim that an improvement has been made, we need to have clear measures in place and monitor the application of what we are doing and check the performance using some measures. So we have defined a few performance measures. You can see here some output indicators in addition to the process indicators that I presented earlier. We are looking at the length of the text, the readability, accessibility, work around formulas, symbols, terms and definitions. And we are producing this type of outputs, which are used internally for us to check how good we are doing in terms of enhancing the ease of use of the documents. And up to now, the work done in the second generation of Eurocodes. So this was a very quick overview in terms of process and what we are doing to meet one of the key objectives of TC250. Let me now move on into the publication process, which I assume is relevant for you to know when things are happening and will have an impact on your profession. Steve presented this timeline. We are now in the work on the second generation, as you can see here. We've got a few phases of the project team work. The last phase will end in November this year with some extra work until February 2022, but overall that work will finish. In terms of specific steps, once the drafting work has concluded, then there is a lot of work that happens later. It's not like the project team has finished the work, the standard is ready for publication. The subcommittees and working groups review the standards, consolidate the work done by multiple project teams as relevant. There is an internal check done by TC250. Then there is the editing stage, translation in German and in French. And then there is the launch of the formal inquiry stage. And then again, review of the standard to address the comments received, check, editing, translation, and then formal vote. And after that, again, editing, translation. And at that point, the document will be made available to the national standard bodies. And then in terms of national annexes, overall, the idea is that there are opportunities to start their development earlier than the availability. It can be possible to start in some cases even before, after the inquiry stage, as you can see here. The publication plan, we have spent a lot of effort on producing a publication plan. And this is because that helped us to define dates, support the project teams, support the subcommittees workload, the CCMC workload. And at the start of the project, we did define a few objectives for the publication plan, which are on this slide here. We wanted to ensure, first of all, the full compatibility of the different Eurocode parts. We wanted to make sure that inquiries and formal votes are done at the right time, but without proposing an excessive burden on the same member states. We want to make the Eurocode parts available as early as possible, also considering that different parts may have interdependencies with other Eurocode parts, and we need to recognize that. And also allow sufficient time to develop the national annexes at national level. So to allow this, the publication plan does contain, and of course, allowing time to remove conflicting standards in each country. So to do that, we took this high-level plan and we then implemented a very detailed publication plan with all dates for when different things should. And this has been really helpful for all the parties involved in the Eurocodes evolution. It does help, for example, to understand the workload of CCMC, the workload of the DIN, AFNOR for translation, but more importantly, it does help to identify the dates when inquiries and formal votes will be done. We've got 2 slots for inquiry each year in March and September each year, and 2 slots for formal vote in April and October. So using the plan, we have been able to plot this graph, which shows that we're gonna have 65 documents for inquiry and 73 documents for formal vote. Now you can see on the screen the list of documents which have gone through inquiry and also the documents that went through formal vote. There is, of course, a longer list for the work to be done. You could see on the next slide, for example, an extract of the expected inquiries and formal votes happening next year, because now the inquiry and formal vote slots have been completed for 2021. So what happens next then? We're going to have the formal votes for the SEN technical specifications happening, as well as the SEN inquiries and the formal votes for the EN parts. Of course, in parallel, national standard bodies may also start developing the national annexes, and they may have different policies for doing that. And then there are the wider implementation actions and activities, including the work with the client organizations at national level to support the implementation. So in the end, we expect to have 8 SEN technical specifications, which cover membrane structures, fiber polymer composites, structural glass, timber composites, and assessment of existing structures. But this last one will be converted into an actual EN standard, as long as the other 64 EN parts at the end of the process. So that takes me to the end of this presentation. And I can see that there are a few questions raised. So Steve Risto, how do you want to manage that? If you're talking.
Okay. So I will, as mentioned in the beginning, so you can put the questions in this question and answers Q&A box in the Zoom, and we try to answer those questions as well we can. And I think the first question is already there, and it's it stands for that how far are you going to do for easing the use of the Eurocodes, and when do you think that something should be end up into manuals instead? And I understand this question like this one, that of course the basic things are in the standard, but then later on there are those formulas and instructions will also come to other design manuals. And
Steve, do you want to take it, or I can take it?
Perhaps if I start and then you can add some more to it, because actually I think it's a really, really good question. How far do we go in applying ease of use, and when do you think something should end up in manuals instead? I think it's a very, very good question, because I think it captures the fact that standards have a certain role to play, but there is a companion role for manuals and guides, and that we shouldn't confuse the two. And so the important thing here for me are what I said around the target audience. That we write the standards so that they can be used by the target audience, the primary target audience. But actually, if you were new to a field, if you're a graduate engineer, then you are certainly going to need manuals and other guidance documents. And also something else which is really important is that, you know, the Eurocodes are written so that they can be applied quite generally. And it's certainly the case that if you narrow the field of application of certain things that are dealt with within the Eurocode, then it's possible to create some simplifications. And I think that can be very helpful, particularly for, you know, practitioners working on smaller scale projects, for example, where there just isn't the need to go into things in the detail that there might be for larger projects. So it's a really good question, and it's something that we are thinking about. Marie-Pierre and I over the years have sometimes drawn the analogy with recipe books, you know, and the first cookery book you get tends to tell you step by step exactly what to do. If you look at the kind of cookery books on the shelves of a professional chef, they'd be very, very different. And actually what we're trying to do with the Eurocodes is find that sweet spot between the two for the competent practitioner, but we absolutely recognize the importance of there being companion manuals and guides. But Marie-Pierre, anything else you want to add to that?
No, I think that was what I wanted to say, particularly the focus on the target audience, which to me is a key one. So if we recognize that the Eurocodes are for competent practitioners, that means that anything which is felt as a textbook material, you could actually see when you read the standard, when you review a standard, when there is textbook material there, which is better placed into a manual, or it's material for the university, for example. We found a few cases of that already. Graduates will be absolutely able to use the Eurocodes, but the target audience is a different one, are competent practitioners. So they will need additional tools like manuals, for example, to apply the Eurocodes.
So I see we have a couple of questions relating to the assessment standard. Perhaps it'd be helpful for me to pick those up.
Yeah.
So Steve,
okay, yeah. There's a question about that. Will the standards of assessment be included or separate issue with the second generation of the Eurocodes?
Yeah. Sure. So let me pick up, and Steve Rhodes has asked about Eurocodes covering assessment. So let me just outline what is going to be produced as part of the second generation, and then where it will be. So the principal new content that's being developed is around the basis of assessment. So it is the companion to the basis of design, information for design. There is a basis for assessment documentation that's being developed. That's been released as a technical specification, and we are working to develop that material further so it's suitable to have as an EN content. There is also in terms of the material side of things, there will be some content in the new EN 1992. There is existing content in EN 1998 for seismic assessment, and that will be updated. But there is not going to be coverage in the other material part. So the focus for us for second generation is very much on the basis of assessment. And the working hypothesis so far has been that will be contained within a part 2 of EN 1990. Now that's very much a working hypothesis because we wanted to see what that document was going to look like, to then enable the SEN members to make a decision on whether that material could be contained within an annex to EN 1990, should be a part to EN 1990, or should be a standalone document. And those 3 options are still on the table. But in order for the team to write something, we needed to have a working hypothesis, and that working hypothesis was that the basis of assessment would be contained as a part 2 for EN 1990.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Steve. And then there's this important issue about assessment of existing structures, and you mentioned in the beginning that the courses are special in that sense that they allows you to do verification before the things are built. But how is this existing structures, which is of course more and more important because plans are changing and we change the purpose of the structures during their lifetime and so on.
You know, I see Bonnie Young has asked another really interesting question that couples the assessment of existing structures, but also with environmental actions and climate change. It's a very, very, very interesting, companion set of questions here. Look, I think, part of one of the questions is it going to take us too long to get there in terms of the content on new climatic action information? Again, let me talk about what we're going to do, and then I can come back into the question a little further. So the important thing that we're going to do around climatic actions is that we have a consistent model now within each of the actions parts, environmental actions parts, as wind, snow, thermal, where not only do we make the wind map, snow map, thermal map, temperature map a nationally determined parameter, so that we expect those to be included within the national annexes. We also state as a requirement that the implications of climate change need to be taken into account. And we say that that can be done by applying a factor of change, a scaling factor, to that wind, snow, and temperature information. And that the definition of that scaling factor is again a nationally determined parameter because it will be geographically sensitive. Now, that scaling factor for snow and for wind is a multiplying factor. For temperature, obviously, that doesn't work. It needs to be a delta. And again, that's included. And we've had really good engagement with, for example, the Copernicus Climate Science Project or the Commission's Mandate 526 team around whether that's an appropriate, it's obviously quite a simplified model, but is that an appropriate model for us to have within a design standard? And that's been really positively supported. It's been a really good engagement. And by creating that hook, if you like, we have now set out a framework that the climate scientists can work with the structural engineers, the NSBs, so that when the national annexes are produced, they can use, if you like, this hook that we've created within the Eurocodes to take account of climate change. Bonnie, I am sensitive to the fact that it'll take a little while for all of this to be out and used, and is that soon enough? Of course, countries could adapt national annexes today, actually, if they wanted to, but I think but actually, in terms of the maturity of the climate science and that calibration, there is quite a lot of work to do, and there's quite a lot of work to do, actually, and so it is going to take some time, actually, for some of the climate science and its application to mature to the point of being able to calibrate these factors of change. And I love the way you've coupled this with assessment of existing structures, because actually, I think as engineers, one of the best things we can do, one of the greatest contributions we can make to the crucial need to decarbonize is actually to extend the life of existing structures, so we're not wasteful in our use of resources. And so I really like the way you coupled those two questions, those two parts of your question. And I think, Marie-Pierre, you wanted to add a little bit more to this.
Well, I was actually wanted to talk around the NDP's aspects, as you said. I mean, in terms of publication, it is really hard to do something before the set dates we have because of all the steps that we have presented. So the time scale for this is going to be as it is. It's very unlikely that this can be done before. But equally, it is still, well, if you think about the time that took the first generation to be published, which was 40 years, now will be done in significantly less time, which is still a success. It's not what we expected, but yeah, it is what it is at the moment.
I think, Marie-Pierre, it's also probably worth noting that, and we haven't talked about it at all today, but one of the other things that we've sought to do, or we're seeking to do with the second generation, is to highlight some particular matters that affect the design, but are really appropriate to agree on a project-specific basis. So that exists within the first generation, but actually there's quite a lot of different ways in which they are identified. There's different language used in the different standards. So we've tried to be very strict about the way in which that's done. And then on things like climate change, we've given the national annexes should cover this, but there may also be a need, and we flagged it, or the potential benefit in some project-specific decisions to be taken around this. So we've looked to build that into the overall framework as well. And I think, that's going to be true for the future, but actually in my experience, and I work on a lot of projects, on a number of projects, actually we already take account of climate change in setting some of the parameters that we design to that are more onerous than exist within current standards, because it's the right thing to do. If you're designing a long life asset on a major infrastructure scheme, it's the right thing to do. It's part of my company's policy that we ask ourselves those kind of questions before we embark upon a design.
I like the question from Steve. The title, if we get rid of the euro.
Yeah, yes. So Steve Rhodes has asked a question about if we didn't call them Eurocodes, would they get used more internationally outside of Europe? And I think the Americans have been very savvy in producing the international building code, because although it's fundamentally based on an American standard, it's not quite as obvious as calling them the Eurocodes. Do you know what? That's I think what is in the control of TC250 and Mario Pierre and I work very hard on is to try and make the standards as good as possible. And my hope is that working with all the experts across Europe, if we make these standards as good as possible, actually that will be the driving motivation for them to be used internationally, and hopefully other factors won't come into play.
And on that, Steve.
Okay, yeah. Maria Pierre has something more to say on this.
Yeah, just to say that there is a lot of work going on by JRC of the European Commission on essentially advertising the Eurocodes across the world, and the success has been huge. Every time that we have a coordination group or TC250 meeting, there are more countries who are adopting the Eurocodes internationally or implementing the Eurocodes in their own countries. So it's something that already happens. The idea of, so it is already in place. It's slightly different than a pure national annex, let's say. Oh, and I just want to add another thing here on that, because I was asked about a similar question on the implementation in Australia, for example. We also have to consider that, yes, the Eurocodes may be adopted, but in order to work properly, they work, as Steve said before, in conjunction with product and execution standards. So at national level, there should also be this wider adoption, let's say, not just of the Eurocodes, but also of the associated product and execution standards in order to make everything work, which is a decision that they can make if they want to.
Okay, thank you. There's one interesting question still that I also have the same question myself. So were experimental information from the first generation Eurocodes now considered, and have they brought some modification to empirical formula in the second generation? And my own question was also that, Steve, you mentioned in the beginning that, okay, you bring research to practice by Eurocode. So how much research is done, especially for the second generation of Eurocodes?
Mario Pierre, why don't you go first on this one, and then I'll go a second.
Yeah, sure. So when the project team started to work on the Eurocode drafts, they didn't start from the scratch. They had available information from collected over the years through the systematic review comments. There has been a lot of background information and research undertaken over the last few years, which has been used by the project teams to update the content of the Eurocodes. So certainly there have been examples and cases where the experimental information has been used and formulae have changed because of the research undertaken over the last few years. So the answer is yes, in short.
But I think just to add a little bit, there is a balance, and you will have seen this in what I said about within the principles, that new research needs to also have had sufficient practical experience to make sure that it is sufficiently grounded for it to be appropriate to include within a standard. That the material has to have a certain maturity before it's appropriate to include it within the standard. And prior to that, it may be suitable for pre-standard, it may be suitable for pre-normative documents. You know, IABSE produce, you know, fantastic guides. There are other bodies that produce excellent work, you know, that put pre-normative material into the public domain so that it can be used, it can be trialed, and then when it's reached that level of maturity that's appropriate, it can then transition into standards. And we've tried very hard to try and get that balance right. You know, it wouldn't be right for, you know, a PhD published, you know, a few months earlier to then you know, without having seen, you know, some real scrutiny, it wouldn't be appropriate for that just to feed straight across into a Eurocode. It needs to have some maturity, and we've been working hard to get that balance right.
Okay, there seems to be one comment more about this matter. So to Eurocode 2, the FIB research work has been relevant, probably.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely, and the you know, I think it is absolutely the desire of FIB, and FIB is an organisation that I've been heavily involved in over years. But the desire of FIB that the purpose of producing things like the FIB model code is for it to help inform the development of normative documents, and certainly in the case of the 1992, the FIB model code work was a major influence, very helpful influence.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that the question screen is now empty, and also our time is almost filled. So thank you very much for Steve and Maria-Pia for excellent presentation and clear answers to the good questions, and also would like to thank the audience for coming, and also Brinda and Firat from the IABSE headquarters for hosting this event. So thank you very much.
Thanks.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, Risto. Thanks, everybody.